mismatched?
Definitely,
or other
yes.
priorities?
Definitely, yes. To just begin with, Nairobi, as per research that Amnesty did in 2009, it established that more than half the population of Nairobi live and work in the slums. So we're talking about more than half Nairobi population not having security of tenure. And when you look at the approach the government has taken, it has always been forcibly evicting people and removing them from where they are. They do not know how much it hurts the economy of this country, the economy of this city, but most importantly, how much difficult it is to even start addressing homelessness as opposed to a situation where we're talking about adequate housing. So my thoughts about this is that for Jubilee administration to deliver adequate housing as one of their big four agendas, they will, number one, have to stop completely forcibly evicting people. Number two, they will have to mainstream slums in the master plan. I'll tell you, and it's quite shocking, the Nairobi master plan, which was established, which was developed in 1948, reviewed in 1973 and reviewed in 1983, has never had slums in the master plan. So when you look at Kibera in the Nairobi master plan, you see a forest. When you look at Mathare, you see a quarry. When you look at Korogosho, you see grassland. And this is where half the population is. That's crazy. It's ridiculous.
Let's talk about this. Of course, you've mentioned matters to do with forcible evictions. First of all, in this case, to mean, are these people staying there illegally? And in the first place, how comes they've been established for far too long, and the government is only coming to evict them much, much later? Are we having an issue where people are staying illegally in these places?
I do not agree with any illegal residence of any human being on the planet, because it is in the first place state's obligation to respect, protect and fulfill the right to adequate housing. So that by the mere fact that people are living the same way they are living in these different slums, in 144 slums in Nairobi and many others in Mombasa and Kisumu, is already a violation of their human rights. So the state cannot even attempt to start forcibly evicting them that because they are living illegally, they're occupying those spaces illegally. It is because of the failure of the state to provide low-cost housing, which is a state obligation. They should be able to provide low-cost housing so that people do not go squatting others, occupying other lands that are either crown land, public land, or private land. So it is in the first place failure of the state, omission or commission, that people live the same way. So there's nothing like illegally staying in an area.
All right, just to bring this up, of course, we know the government has had some input, in terms of construction and even provision of these housing facilities to people who live in these low-income estates. But sometimes we've even heard it on mainstream media and other, media sources that people who have been allocated these spaces have yet again taken them up and sold them off or even leased to other people. How can this be addressed when the government probably is working on one side, but this is not being well received from the other end?
I think we really appreciate the role the government has played to attempt to provide low-cost housing. But let me tell you that for my housing to be adequate, it's not just about providing that beautiful four-walled and a roof on top. It is about adequacy in the sense that it has to meet all the tenets of housing. It has to be affordable. It has to be culturally adequate. It has to be habitable. In most cases, for example, I'll give you examples where people have had very good, beautiful housing, but it has not met their cultural adequacy. For example, it is one single room that is very beautiful, built of very good materials, but this is just one room. I am a mother with children, sometimes adult children, sometimes with my mother over there, maybe sometimes with a husband. You cannot all be in that room. Sometimes it does not even meet the tenet of affordability. And sometimes a lot of these slum people will be like, I live in this one room here, but in front of my house is where I sell my tomatoes and onions, and I make my livelihood that way. If the housing that is provided does not meet these tenets, then it is not good to me. I'd rather go back to the slum where I can be able to meet all the useful, necessary tenets, inadequate as it might be. but I'll be able to continue with my life.
So are you saying there is a bridge between, you know, what the government eventually comes up, you know, to facilitate those living in the low-income estates and what the those from the estates are actually looking for? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, exactly. And I think the government needs to reconsider the role and the contribution of the people who live the issue. When they're thinking upgrading, for example, they need to speak to the people. They need to have genuine consultation with the people to understand what is the need that we're trying to fill in this situation. Otherwise, we'll have white elephants. Otherwise, we'll have projects that people will not bother taking up. We'll have projects that will be mad with a lot of corruption, basically because the government did not allow people to inform the projects.
All right. Of course, Naomi, you're not only passionate about, you know, matters housing in the cities or urban setup, so to speak. You're also, you know, passionate about it in rural areas. Tell us more about it.
For the last 3 years, I've ventured in a very new area, and this new area has been indigenous people's rights. For a long time, I focused on sexual and gender-based violence and adequate housing rights. But for the last 3 years, I've been focusing, I did this research together with a colleague who is based in London, and we published a report on the indigenous people, the Sengwer community, who live in the forest of Embobut. And we able to establish a lot of human rights violations that the Sengwer are going through, historical and current injustices, and namely a few like adequate housing, attacks to human rights defenders in the community, denial of free, prior and informed consent by the indigenous people, but also, just most importantly, not being allowed to showcase their prowess in conservation and infiltration.
All right, and of course that becomes a very sensitive topic right there, because right now you can see probably the government is moving, you know, to add value from, to the products from forests, say mining and other resources. And of course here is a people who are really determined to maintain their culture and to stay put wherever they are. Now, as a human rights defender, what then should be done at such a point?
Most importantly, allow indigenous people free, prior and informed consent. Simply means that in whatever development project agenda the government has, allow the indigenous people to guide this process, allow them to consent on whatever development that will take place, as long as it does not interfere with their way of life, with their lifestyles, as long as it does not affect their identity, but most importantly also support them to undertake indigenous knowledge in conservation, because research has shown that forests that are conserved by indigenous people thrive better than forests that are conserved by other people, be it CFAs, who are community forest association, or government. So the indigenous people have proved to be the custodians, and they're the best in conserving forests.
Well, definitely such an engaging conversation. This is a great interview, of course, I can tell you that for certain, but we're running short of time. And of course now, maybe in your winding up remarks, what final words would you offer to Kenyans when it comes to matters housing, and of course maybe a word to government?
For Kenyans, I would say, especially those who are suffering violations on the right to adequate housing, don't get discouraged. The Constitution supports our right to adequate housing. Keep fighting, keep claiming and defending your rights to adequate housing. For government, the government, especially on the infrastructural programs, we are struggling with Kura, we're struggling with Kenha. The state has the obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights of human beings in the state.
Well, all right then, very well said, and definitely a comprehensive closing remark from Naomi Baraza, who is a Right to Educate Housing Program Campaigns Manager and Amnesty International. Of course, she wears so many hats, and of course, she did share her contribution to society with us right here on Engine Behind the Power tonight on matters affordable housing, which is President Uhuru Kenyatta's part of the Big Four agenda. And we thank you so much, Naomi, for that contribution. And we end this segment right here. Regina Manyara is up next as she brings us the latest from the business desk.